origin on these columns. And what you have on the outside of the column, what you see are these various colors, which are blacks and reds and oranges. And the question is, how did this get in here? Well, the columns formed, and then after they formed, millions of years after, there was what was known as a mineralizing event. So from underneath, ascending, rising solutions of a hot spring nature came up and came in along all the fractures and breaks, and they brought with them quartz and iron and manganese and probably some gold and silver mineralization. And they invaded the rock, and then they began to replace the rock. And if you look at the face of these, you can actually see where these solutions have come in and actually invaded and replaced the rock. These dark areas are replacement fronts where the solutions have invaded and then replaced the rock. Then the whole system stopped, and the thing was raised up, exposed its surface, and then surface water began to percolate down through it, and the sulfides and other minerals altered to oxides. So the iron sulfide material altered to these reddish things are hematite. It's common rust. It's ferric oxide. And then the more yellow and brownish material that you see on a lot of these, that's a limonite, which is a hydrated iron oxide. The black material is a manganese oxide, and it comes in a number of forms. You have the coatings of black material, which is a manganese oxide, and then you have these what are known as dendrites, and they look like little ferns or something that are on the rock, and they're manganese dendrites, manganese oxide. And once again, it's like iron. It can be ferric or ferrous, and so manganese is the same way. And it has several different forms depending on the valence state of the manganese in the oxide itself. And some of the oxides that you see on here are primary. In other words, they came in when this stuff was initial. Some are secondary. They occurred when it was exposed at surface and weathered. Now, the unusual thing about it is they're color fast, which no amount of washing or rubbing or whatnot will take them off. And a lot of that is due to the fact that a lot of the oxides are primary, and they're encapsulated with silica. So quartz has come in and it's encapsulated. There's a lot of colorful rocks, but very few color-fast colorful rocks, and that's what this is. So you can make a big feature out of this, and your customer's not going to call you a year later and say, "Hey, it all washed off."
Yeah. So, Greg, it's fair to say that this stuff is in the neighborhood of 45 million years old, but it didn't look like this from the beginning. It took millions of years after the original volcanic event for what you see to develop, all the different colors and the various minerals. And
there was a lot of events took place to give this its final look.
Yeah. So
first off,
it looked like this. Go ahead.
Well, first off, it formed as part of a volcanic sequence of events about 40 to 45 million years ago. There was what's known as a graben, which is a big block of earth that sank, and as it sank, volcanic activity filled it in, and these flows here are part of what's known as a rattlesnake formation, which filled this graben in. But it didn't just fill it in little flows and whatnot. There were domes that built up and complex intrusion, extrusion. But as this stuff poured out and cooled, it cracked and formed these columns, and that was the first step. And
so the shape.
the shape, and the shape is complex. There's straight columns, there's twisted columns, there's columns with these little check marks on them. All of that's part of the process of formation of the column. And what happened is this stuff was cooling. If there was any movement or flexing or whatnot, that would create this twisting and turning. And so you can read a story and all those little marks that are on there for each individual column. There's little minor events and major events are all recorded on them. Anyway, after they were in place, then the whole mass sat there for a long time, and then later magmatic events created these mineralizing solutions that came in, and then subsequent to that, the whole thing was exposed at surface, and now we're quarrying it. The rock itself, as you can see, it's not a basalt. The big columns you see, the real common ones, are basalt. And this material is closer to an andesite. And you see these little white, they're called phenocrysts. They're actually crystals. They're feldspar crystals, plagioclase feldspar crystals in what is known as an aphanitic ground mass. This gray material is so fine you can't see crystal forms in it. You have to cut it and look at it under a microscope and see them. But if you did a chemical analysis of this rock would have more potassium in it, and as compared with the Columbia River basalts, which are much younger, maybe half as young, in the neighborhood of 20 million years, something like that. And so those big columns of olive drab, big columns, they're from the Columbia River basalt, which was a huge planet-scale event that filled in 3 states full of enormous outpouring of basalt. This is more or less a local feature up here.
I like to take issue with one of the details. He said 20 million years old, but I think it's 20 million and one, because I heard that last year that it was.
It very well could be. There's a monstrous outpouring. Lots of theories about it.
They said that a year ago.
Oh, is that right?
No, I'm just kidding.
So that's why you're recording me, right?
20 million and one.
Anyway, the formation of columns is really a very common thing. Most basaltic rocks, basic rocks, will form columns, and either very poorly formed or very well formed. These columns, the unusual thing about them is they're perfectly formed small columns, and the big columns are very common. The +8 to up to 24 inch are very common.
I suppose this could be in the ground or something similar to it other places, and we don't know about that.
Oh, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's.
But this is the only known source of this.
Well, particularly where you've got such a consistent an ability to produce a consistent volume, and the nature of them is so consistent like that for small columns. They average 3.5 inches in diameter, and if you can, call that a diameter, versus the bigger columns will average probably closer to 20 inch. Of course, as you saw, the cooks sell a lot of medium column, which we also are going to be attempting to produce up there. We've got some 6-inch type of columns, which we definitely want to produce. I think you'd find those really usable for fountains and for other features, but we haven't succeeded yet. They underlie this thing, and they're related to the event, but quite frankly, we haven't figured out the detailed emplacement history of this thing yet ourselves. It was a series of flows. The underlying big columns transist up into the small columns as well. Whether it poured out over the uneven surface and you had a basin, big columns for perpendicular to the cooling surfaces, or whether it was actually a dike or plug-like mass that came up through the earth, and like Mount St. Helens, it forms a dome which just oozes up out of the earth and flows around it. We're not really sure about all that yet.
Why would so it's the cooling that makes it break in or form into columns like this?
That's correct.
Why would is it slower cooling, or is there some theory as to why these would form in smaller than most basalt that's known?
It's related to a number of things. It starts off with the actual lithology. It has to be a specific lithology which affects the cooling as well. Each chemical makeup of a magma will have different cooling characteristics. It will crystallize at different temperatures. And when you see these porphyritic masses, when this stone was extruded or as a flow or intruded as a thing, these crystals were already crystallized. So it was a crystalline mush, if you will. So the physical characteristics were already partly established by the fact that it's porphyritic. The mass, the gray ground mass in here, that crystallized after it extruded. So already you've created a unique cooling medium that's going to crystallize. It's already partly crystallized. So to form the exact conditions necessary to form small column versus big column is going to be a function of the physical and cooling characteristics of the parent magma, which in this case is a unique lithology. It happened to coincide with the cooling environment and the cooling characteristics of the stone and the stability of the system to allow these long spires to form, which are just like mud cracks in a lake. It's a shrinkage phenomenon. This thing intrudes in and it'll crystallize, and when it finally cools, it changes volume. And because of that, it will crack. And you'll develop these cooling cracks, which are these hexagonal shaped cracks, just like mud cracks on a lake.
And what accounts for the fact that the quarry block, the larger ones, are all clustered together? When it contracted, was there space in between them that then later filled with the sediment, or?
No, the mass intrudes as a massive magma, and then it cools, and at some point it crystallizes. And when it crystallizes, then stresses are set up because it is no longer a fluid mass. It loses all of its fluid characteristics and it becomes a crystalline solid. And at that point it generally fractures internally, which this is what this did. It fractured internally. There's no space really to speak of, but it is fractured along that plane.
So when it contracts, when it cools and contracts and forms into groups like this, it doesn't contract enough to create space in between them. It's just, but that is such an odd phenomenon, and it's great for us because you can get to columns instead of having one big piece that you can't do anything with. Well,
then, like I say, later on, the fluids came up, and found access via those microfractures,
yes,
which is what these were, microfractures.
And the time that it would take to get in that narrow space, it's like...
And they healed. Like I say, they brought in healing solutions, so they solidified the mass by essentially re-cementing it together.
Right, okay.
So the crystal blocks, here, if you look at this one right here, you'll see it doesn't have any oxide on it. This is more or less the fresh siliceous material that's been in place. And that material more or less rehealed the whole mass. So you get the crystal blocks and they've basically been stuck back together. But the degree of these cracks, they're microfractures. You need to think of them as microfractures. And so when the crystal blocks are still stuck together, to an extent, they never were fractured that badly. The fractures that were there are poorly. The planes are there. The planes of you can need to think of them more as a plane of weakness. It doesn't really release like you would think of a fault where there's movement or separation or anything like that. It's a microfracture is what it is. It's a stress release. So some places it releases more than others, and then you got to think also in terms of this cooling mass sitting here steaming away. There's more activity, more magma's moving, and so the whole mass is shifting and moving. It's very, dynamic situation. Volcano and the domes and flows and everything around them. You've seen the ones in Hawaii, for instance, that move that far in an hour. They just do this big mass of hot material moving slowly down the mountain. That's kind of this kind of lava that this would be, whereas some lavas are very fluid and they flow like water. Rod Haberle's stuff over there, that black dunite, would be one. It would have a viscosity very similar to water. It's very unusual magma, whereas this material has a very low viscosity.
That makes it, besides how strikingly beautiful it is to look at it, and just simply knowing it's a natural product, to recognize all these forces that came to play in the creation of it and the time that it took, just adds I think a scientifically fascinating aspect to it that, combined with the beauty of it, really makes it quite a find.
Oh yeah, well, you got the original thing, and then you can look at all this stuff like these rings around in here. You've got an oxide, a surface oxidization of this stuff, and so you've got a chemical system going on here, what they call Lisa-Gang rings, which you can see all of them here. And as the surface water's penetrated down into this, there's these chemical gradients are all set up, and the stuff is taking original material and it's oxidizing it because it was stable when it was in place. You expose it at surface, it's unstable, and then so it wants to become stable. So chemically it changes to these oxides, and all these little fronts are really interesting, where the water's dissolve material and then redeposit it, and then dissolve it again and redeposit it. You have a rainy year and unrainy year. The groundwater system is a very dynamic thing too. But they're pretty. You guys use these bases at all?
We haven't so far.